Hello, my name is Arthur Melman, and I want to welcome you to our inaugural show of GGG Insights Summer Series, The Future of East Hampton. What we hope to do during the course of this series is listen to a lot of voices in town, politicians, non-politicians, cops, firemen, business owners, retirees, clergy, school teachers. You got the idea. To learn what people think the challenges, the problems, and the opportunities are for the future of East Hampton. Today, we have as our first guest, Zach Cohen, who's been very active in civic affairs in East Hampton, in nature preserve work, and in a myriad of other service community service opportunities here in the town. Zach has a very interesting background, having started off in Miami Beach in a restaurant specializing in cheesecake. So, Zach, give us some of your background.
I'll try to be fast.
And don't skip the cheesecake.
No. I'll start with the cheesecake. Yes, I grew up in what you might call delicatessens on steroids, where I spent most of my time, usually after school. And I think it's relevant because coming out of a service industry like that and coming out of Miami Beach, I understand how resorts communities can prosper, how they can make bad decisions. Mm-hmm. I personally feel that some of the community aspects of Miami Beach withered faster and much more so than here in East Hampton that's done a better job. I also get used to, unfortunately I say yes too much because I'm just used to taking orders and then having to go fulfill them. Somehow I escaped that and ended up at Berkeley studying math and philosophy and logic. And
I thought you were a revolutionary, not a.
My wife thought I was. My wife thought I was, and then she learned I was just more of a nerd. Mm-hmm. And that why that's relevant is I was forever helped or ruined, depending on your point of view, of wanting to analyze things logically, even more so than my roommates who were lawyers, who I drive them crazy because they said, no, you're trying to win. You're not trying. That doesn't mean you're trying to out-argue. At age 48, I went back to University of Chicago and picked up an MBA in economics and actually mathematical finance. And the only other thing I'll say about my education that will show my humanizing side is I actually was a composing student in Tanglewood in 1969, and I'm an active amateur pianist.
So you're a nerdy, mathematically oriented nerd who also plays music and makes cheesecake.
I am somewhat known for my desserts.
What else have you done here in town?
Okay, so back into town. I've been chair of the town's Nature Preserve Committee for about 10 years now. I'd love to find somebody to take it over, but then I won't list. I've been on a lot of committees. Some of the important. I was with you on the Budget Finance Advisory Committee for a while back around 2010, and tried to help out in sorting out what really went on with the financial problems at the end of 2008, 2009.
That was under Bill Wilkinson, who set that up.
Oh, Bill Wilkinson set that up. Yeah,
yep,
right. Yes, that is correct. It was. I wish we would bring it back myself. We could use it. I think we could use a law advisory myself too, committee. Other things on the government side, I've been vice chair of the Spring CAC for quite a while. I'll put a plug in there. I really think the Spring CAC helps uphold the sense of a small town community in Springs, and more people are discovering it, and they move there, sometimes for economic reasons because the houses are less expensive, but they always come around. Some of them now are coming and say, no, we chose to move here because we love the way this still operates like a little community.
Well, you still have the Springs General Store, and more importantly, you've got Loring Bolger, who's head of the CAC, who is non-stoppable.
That's correct. We have my wife who runs the Springs Food Pantry with lots of help, and I'll jump some of our projects right now. We plus a woman who's Jess Frost, who's a curator at Guildhall. We've helped revive what we call the Art Center at Duck Creek, where we're putting on, at a historic town-owned property, we're putting on art events. I'm coordinating more of the classical music events. The Pollock Krasner lectures are happening there. So we really try to have things happen in the spring. Another thing.
Well, Zach, I mean, one of the things that you seem to be touching on, whether you realize it or not,
Yes.
is your love for the fact that this is a community.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we're going to be talking about is the way the word community has sort of eroded as we have fewer and fewer people, for example, who can afford the time or have the interest in serving in the fire department or other activities like that, because our population is changing. What are some of the problems you see that we should be thinking about in our whole series of programs here? Because everything has unintended consequences. I mean, you know more about the
Yes.
CPF than probably anybody alive,
I
except
won't
Fred Thiel. I don't know.
Yes. Well, and I know we're going to talk in depth about some of those things. Obviously affordability, but let's talk about some things related to the CPF that you mentioned and unintended consequences in community. When I published my analysis of the finances of the Community Preservation Fund in 2009, I believe, I wrote a cover sheet and I said, to me, the driving force why I did this is that it is not just a land purchasing program. It's not called the Land Acquisition Fund. It's called Community Preservation.
Yeah, that's a very important word, community.
And I have felt that to some degree we've let that down, partially because there's a real fear that I sense, and I've been at a level in politics to be able to talk to people. I won't mention names, but there's a real fear that people who support open space, preservation, all the good things, the phenomenal things that it does, they're nervous to bring up that there might be unintended consequences because they're worried that there'll be an incorrect reaction. So what I mean by that is, I've studied enough economics. I personally think anyone who studied economics in the first year in college would know that the purchases by the Community Preservation Fund must have a negative effect on affordability. There's no ifs, ands, or buts.
Well, how can you explain that?
Yes, I will explain it.
Forget the fact that some people took economics in college and slept through most of those lectures, but we all go to the grocery store and we buy things.
So let me explain. There are two main ways when you have a commodity that's desired, that's in limited supply, that the price has changed. One is a change.
Land in East Hampton.
Yes.
Okay.
One is a change in supply, but the other is a change in demand. So a lot of people say to me, oh, no, it couldn't be affecting affordability because we only buy expensive properties. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but they're wrong because even if you buy up all the high units of the penthouses in an apartment building in the top 5 floors, it'll affect on the prices on the lower units too. Okay. Also, these days, sometimes we do buy things that would have been subdivided, or in the old days more. But here's the big that you can't get around, is that if the CPF is considered a successful program, it's improving the quality of life in East Hampton. If it's improving the quality of life in East Hampton, it's making the existing land you can buy more valuable. So that just
and more expensive.
And more expensive. So just as soon as you say the CPF is successful, you also, with any economic training, have to say it's making more desirable. Making more desirable means what we have now, a house comes up that costs $1 million, and if there are 20 people who want it, 19 of them, it's a vacation home, and it's more affordable to them than it is to the one local person who wants to buy it, who has to figure out if I need 2 mortgages and going to borrow from my father, or mother to get it.
So basically what you're saying, everybody says, well, if we preserve land with the Community Preservation Fund, we're going to increase the value of all the other land, and that's terrific. And we're going to have more scenic views, more farms. But you're saying, wait a minute, the negative unintended consequence is Joe the fireman or Joe the carpenter now finds it's much more expensive to buy his relatively small piece of land because there's more demand for it.
Sure, or any house that's, or houses that Joe, plumber, whatever it is, would be thrilled to buy that might be a 1980s three-bedroom house that he'll find a way to shoehorn his developing family into is just nothing but a tear down to somebody else who's willing to outbid him because they're looking at turning that $1 million tear down into a $2 million. The wrong response is, oh, well, then we have to reduce the CPF activity. No, the right response is to adjust the CPF so that what's built into it is that it too participates in the affordable housing program. So that's one of the simplest.
Well, you know what happens? I mean, we just went through using, 20% of the CPF money for water preservation. Now you're going to strip it of another 20% to build some houses for people who can't afford it.
You have another comment that the people who, like me, who do the numbers are not encouraged to bring forward, but if you spend from now to 2050 all of the money that the CPF is going to raise.
It's about 30 years, 2050, roughly 30 years. And what does it raise? It raises $20 million a year, $30 million a year?
I figure 25 at today's, a minimum of 20.
So $750 million.
Yeah. If you put all of that into buying land, you're really going to have a problem of what I just said in terms of, what's there left for the ordinary person, because the ordinary person is always going to be outbid for the remainder. There was a lot of worries over the 20% going to water quality. First of all, it's not a mandatory 20%, and we haven't come close to spending the 20%. It's up to 20%. Secondly...
Well, Zach, let me ask you this. This is my question. I perhaps misunderstood this. It says that you can spend up to 20% on water quality issues or projects, but if you don't, it doesn't carry over to the next year. You got to start all over again next year?
Unfortunately, and this is, I've actually tried to advise some people, I said, if you have if you sequester the money by approving a project in 2018, you can, in a sense, be pulling out of money coming in the future. But you would have had to have approved that project in 2018 to pull it again.
That's too complicated.
That's
too complicated.
No, it is not. To use it or lose it.
Okay,
right.
that was my
yes.
my observation.
So you can do the same thing with say 10% for affordable housing, land only, and have it the same thing. If they find something great, fine, and if they don't find something great, then it just stays in and they go buy property with it, things like that.
Yeah,
so there are
I
many
think one
ways
thing that's important to understand, though, is it's not just buying property and taking that property off the market. The CPF fund also buys development rights, and the farm has to remain a farm, that type of thing. So the farmer stays in
yes,
place.
there is. And actually some very interesting things they're finally doing that we did recently is we're also starting to buy life estates.
Yeah, so grandma can stay in her house for her lifetime. When she passes along, that house goes to the town. The great thing about that for grandma is she gets the money today while she still needs it to buy medical supplies and food.
Now,
and then
right.
she gives
Now,
up
what's interesting about that is that currently that house would have to be knocked down. If we had a properly...
With grandma, no, I guess grandma has a right to stay there until she
Right, then she leaves, and the only thing we can, unless they've bought the house not using CPF, if they've just bought the land with CPF, bought the house with something else, okay. If it was written correctly, you could be buying properties that are, say, off the water, so they're not as important environmentally, from somebody where they have the right to stay there, but it's a modest house, and it was bought in a way where the house could stay and move into an affordable housing program.
Oh, okay.
If
Okay.
you, if
So
you
what you're
bought- if
talking
you
about
rent-
is not creating new units of cluster affordable housing, but basically taking the housing stock we have today and transitioning it into what may become an affordable unit rather than knockdown.
That's one idea, but also I would see the CPF being able to buy actual properties. And I'll give you an idea of something that could be done today under current law if you could buy the property, but properties, it can cost you $1 million to buy a small lot, sometimes at least $500,000. It would be legal now under some of the town's programs the town could own land. They could allow a person to build a house or build it for them that already had an affordable accessory apartment built into it.
Okay.
And say, okay, you don't have the right, this is not for a big, giant, growing family, it's for a modest family. Now, all of a sudden, you take care of two units at once, and you're just putting duplexes around
Okay,
town.
so going back to...
But let's go other subjects.
Going back to our focus here, what you're saying is we've got to be aware of the unintended consequences of the CPF. It's taking land off the market and therefore driving up the price for Joe the plumber when he wants to buy a piece of land for his house. On the other hand, what you're saying is without changing the law, there are a lot of opportunities for us to use the CPF funds that come in a more creative way that will not denude the CPF of money, but provide the seed money for other things the town should be using it for, such as affordable housing. But let's talk about something else. Because whenever we have, GGG sponsors a lot of debates for politicians running for office. And whenever we mention the word tax reassessment, everybody flies out of the room, except to his credit, Fred Overton, who knows more about this than anybody else because he was the tax assessor before he got on the town board, said he was in favor of an immediate, this was several years ago, tax reassessment. Could you just tell us something? Because I think that has a lot of unintended consequences that make it harder again for Joe the plumber to buy or to basically to build a new house on a small lot.
Well, Arthur, I always like to give credit where it's due, and you're one of the people who discovered the unintended consequences and talked to me about it, which is that basically we do have the most archaic property tax system in New York State. New York State is considered to have the worst property tax system in the nation.
So we're the worst we're the most archaic of the worst.
East Hampton's the worst in the worst
So we're
state.
number one.
Yes.
Depending on how you count. If you count from the top, we count from the bottom.
Yes, I've had, and as you know, the GGG, and I've participated in them, have brought in some of the state officials and things. And I also did going back to my nerdy side, I've done a statistical study. Okay, on to some of these things. It is unbelievably grossly unfair. That's not hard to establish. When my wife likes to also write letters to paper on this. Let's see, one example we brought out one day showed property it closed in 1 week in Amagansett that had a tax assessment of $550 on it and closed for $2.9 million.
That's $2.9 million for $550?
Yes.
Zach, could you and your wife find me another one of those? I mean,
there were more on the street.
That's because they were all older houses and underassessed.
They were basically assessed at land value and, whatever.
50 or 60 years ago.
And we do not reassess unless you build.
Okay, well, let's
You don't reassess on death. You don't reassess on change of ownership. You only reassess it when you build.
So what you're really saying is, I'm Joe the plumber. I find a little parcel, a quarter of an acre someplace, where I build my little house for $500,000, $400,000, whatever it is. And I don't know exactly how much I would pay in taxes, but my guess is I'd pay between school taxes and everything else $5,000 or something pretty close to that. So I'm paying $5,000 on my little affordable house, And this guy who just bought $1.5 million house in Amagansett is paying $550. I mean, that's just absurd.
There was a trade of property in the village a few years ago, and luckily they're building on it, so they'll get to change it. There was 3 parcels with 1 house. The 3 parcels traded for $145 million. Mm-hmm. It sounds like the taxes were a lot. I forget quite exactly what they were, but my calculation. But I think it was. I think the total assessments came out to more like about $18 million, and I calculated that annually.
And this is because it wasn't reassessed. So they were. So the assessment was based on an $18 million value 40 years ago.
Well, 2 were vacant,
Okay.
so that's really tends to be low, and 1, yes, they hadn't done any building. And until the person decides to build, which happened a year or so later, I calculated that the total underpayment of property taxes based on full assessed value to the town and the village were about $750,000.
$750,000. So we're making a $750,000 gift to a poor guy on his butt who can afford a $149 million house.
And what
that's just ridiculous.
I know. So what this points out, then a couple of things, we'll get back to the fairness, besides fairness, and when I did my study, it became obvious to me that the number of people who would experience reductions versus appreciation was very strongly in the favor of, it was not what's often said 1/3 roughly the same, 1/3 up, 1/3 down. It was not. There was a much smaller portion who would see the up. And one is, it's easy to see. If somebody who's got a $100 million house and it's assessed
140. Don't try to undersell this thing. 149. I'm sorry.
Whatever.
We can round to 150.
If somebody's appraisal goes up $100 and some odd million, do you realize how many people whose appraisal is at $1 million can get knocked down to $900,000 or $800,000? So when I did the math, it turned out to overwhelmingly
fall on the shoulders of the biggest houses.
Yes. The bad part, and what really makes it unfair, is there was statistically relevant relationship between, and this is what I thank all my background for. You could show that if you graphed the likelihood of being over or under assessed with the value of the house, the more valuable the house, the greater the likelihood of underassessment. It was not a random.
Okay.
It wasn't random.
So the people with the little houses are subsidizing the people
Yes.
with the big houses,
That's exactly
especially if
what's
they're
going
older
on.
houses.
That's exactly what's going
But okay,
on.
we always though have 2 other things. One, it's going to cost $10 million to do this. To make short shrift of that, the town has some surpluses for the first time, thanks to both Republican and Democratic stewardship of the town's funds. So the money's around in surplus funds to pay for this thing, this reassessment. But what about Grandma, who has a house that she and her husband bought 50 years ago for $100,000, and it's a location that now certainly, even though it's a modest house, might be worth $500,000 or $600,000. You know, she lives on a fixed income. How is she going to, and if her taxes go from $500 to $1,000, that's an immense difference for somebody on a fixed. How can we preserve her ability to stay in that house?
So first, I advocated for what wouldn't be too expensive, an extension of my statistical study where I just looked at 99 houses. We really got to look at a couple thousand, at least 1,000. I prefer a couple thousand. And we may need to have to hand assess 50 or so to make sure we see what the extent of that is. We would like, there is a provision that allows a 5-year phase in. I would like to see something better. Half of the states in the United States, but not New York, which is not well regarded in these matters.
Well, again, we're the worst of the worst.
Yes,
so
has provisions that protect grandmas and reassessment,
Oh.
that allow you, and we would have to decide, is the protection going to be
Age.
like you only go up 2% a year, but the amount you would normally pay accrue, or would the amount you normally pay be forgiven? You know, those would
Sure.
be community
Okay.
decisions.
Now, could we also, Zach, this may sound absurd in this,
Yeah.
but to most people in the world, except for those people who live in East Hampton, could we also say that the first $300,000 of your house value
That's the other-
is an exemption, and you don't pay anything
So
on
we
it?
have raised this too, and it was actually talked about with the same person from the state who came and talked to GGG. That there's already, by the way, for the first one, we might need some help from Fred Thiel and Ken Laval.
Okay.
But I believe there already is provisions for homestead exemptions, similar to what they do in Florida, where it's much more major. And if you think about it, the STAR programs are already very similar to
Yeah, it
that,
doesn't
but they're
really-
not very large.
Yeah.
The STAR program might knock off 30,
Well,
but it's
what I'm focused on is the guy with the $149 million house. If we give him an exemption for the first 100,000, or first 500,000,
That's right.
First 500,000.
You've got the math perfectly.
Took me a while. We still got a house that's worth, for tax purposes, $149,500,000. And grandma is out of tax,
That's
doesn't pay
right.
taxes.
See, it's very, very hard to do laws in New York State, and I wouldn't try to do it that discriminate.
Okay, we're not going to discriminate. We're going to cut you off because this is the end of our first show. We're going to have you back
Right.
for a second one, Zach.
Yeah, we didn't talk about town manager.
We'll get to that, the third one, the fourth one. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll enjoy this show, and more importantly, come to enjoy and expect to see our other shows coming up. Thank you very much.